Before the Civil War began, the North and the South had disagreements about whether newly admitted states should have slavery or not. The biggest factor for the rise in need for slaves came to being when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. By inventing the cotton gin, Southern plantation owners were able to mass-produce cotton and sell it. Cotton later became a major export of the U.S., and it quickly became known as white gold to many Southern farmers. As the U.S. expanded into the West, farmers began to venture out there to create more cotton plantations and wanted slavery to be legal in these regions. As a result, several important documents were released to assuage the disagreements between the North, who wanted to abolish slavery, and the South, who wanted slavery to remain legal. After the Mexican-American War, the U.S. had gained Texas and California. Now the question that came with the new territory was, should slavery be allowed? As a result, Henry Clay, now 70 years old, stepped up to the plate once more to write a compromise. Henry Clay presented this compromise on January 29, 1850 to Congress. The Compromise of 1850 called for a strong Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to assist in the recovery of fugitive slaves. This compromise also admitted California as a free state to pacify the northern states. Texas was also required to relinquish its lands to the USA. In regards to Washington, D.C., the slave trade would be deemed illegal there. However, slavery was still legal within the capital. Tensions rose as Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote her famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which depicted the evils of slavery, starting a wave of anti-slavery thoughts across the nation. The South, on the other hand, regarded the book in disgust, as she was a Northerner and did not understand how things were run down in the South. Because of the publication of this controversial book, a greater divide between the Northerners and Southerners had appeared. As Abraham Lincoln once said, Stowe was indeed the little woman that started the war. Later on, Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act had split the unorganized territory in the Midwest into two new territories called Kansas and Nebraska. Slavery would be determined by popular sovereignty within these regions. As a result, the Missouri Compromise, which was considered sacred at the time, was repealed. The North became angered, and several Northerners now began to openly disregard the Fugitive Slave Act. A new party, called the Republican Party, was also formed as a result of this act. The disagreements between the North and the South worsened when abolitionists began to move to Kansas to make slavery illegal. Consequently, many Southerners moved to Kansas as well. A series of violent political confrontations followed after, and Kansas was now known as Bleeding Kansas. After several more disagreements, controversies, and compromises, the election of 1860 arrived. The result of the election named Abraham Lincoln the new President of the United States of America. This victory for Lincoln would be the major factor for the Southern secession. The South believed that this man would be the one to permanently abolish slavery, despite the fact that Lincoln himself believed in stopping slavery from spreading to the West. Consequently, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. 6 states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit and seceded from the Union. Together, these 7 states formed the Confederate States, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Later on, Lincoln was informed that Fort Sumter, located in the South, lacked supplies and needed them quickly before it was too late. Lincoln was caught in a dilemma. Jefferson Davis had made it clear to Lincoln that if he had sent any ships down to the South, he would take it as an attack. After many nights of thinking and mulling over this problem, Lincoln sent a letter informing Davis of a ship filled with provisions would be making its way down to Fort Sumter. The Confederate Army attacked Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. The South had won, and 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, seceded from the Union. Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri were all slave states, but they had decided to remain with the Union. They became known as the border states. The Civil War had officially begun. On July 21st, The Battle of the First Bull Run began when the Union Army, led by Irvin McDowell, shelled the enemy forces, while more Union troops crossed the river at Sudley Ford with the goal of hitting the Confederate Army's left flank. After more than 2 hours, 10,000 Federals drove back 4,500 rebels across the Washington Turnpike and up Henry House Hill. Reporters and picnic onlookers celebrated a premature Union victory. Unfortunately for the Union Army, reinforcements from both Confederate armies Johnston and Beauregard arrived to help out the Confederate armies. Both the Union and Confederate armies began to fight one another, while the Confederate army sent in new reinforcements now and then. Then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, both sides had an equal amount of soldiers. Beauregard ordered a counterattack along the entire line. As the Confederate soldiers advanced, they began to yell, which later became known as the Rebel Yell, to the Union Army. At last, the Confederate Army managed to break through the Union line. This caused McDowell's troops to flee as Washington civilians who had been viewing the battle earlier began to run away as well. As a result, the Confederate Army had won this battle. From the First Battle of Bull Run, Thomas Jackson earned his nickname Stonewall Jackson when he bravely led a Virginia brigade to take over a high ground position at Henry House Hill. Stonewall Jackson would later be promoted. As for the Union Army, McDowell was removed from his position by President Lincoln and replaced him with George B. McClellan. Their first battle of Bull Run proved to the Union that this would not be a quick and easy war as they had once believed. On September 17, 1862, General Robert E. Lee and his army advanced into Maryland. Lee had devised a complex plan that included separating his outnumbered forces. Unfortunately for Lee, his plan had fallen into the hands of the Union Army. Luckily for Robert E. Lee, though, General McClellan, being the overly cautious man he was, did not utilize this discovery to his advantage. Robert E. Lee and his men were stationed in front of the Potomac River. McClellan planned to overwhelm Lee's left flank, but failed to do so. After the first 4 hours of battling in David Miller's 30-acre cornfield, a series of bloody head-on attacks were used against Lee and his forces. Then finally, the Union troops pierced the line, but were eventually stopped by the late Confederate reinforcements. Eventually, Lee retreated across the river with 10,318 of his forces dead. This battle is known to be the bloodiest day of the Civil War. With the Battle of Antietam ending in a draw, Lincoln released the Emancipation Proclamation that declared that all slaves in the rebelling states were now free. By doing this, Lincoln ensured that foreign nations like Great Britain would not join forces with the South. This was because Lincoln had changed the reason for the war, which was originally started for the purpose of bringing the Union back together. But now that the reason was to fight against the evils of slavery, Great Britain and other nations could not help the South, as it went against their policies. The Battle of Gettysburg began on July 1st when General Robert E. Lee and his forces arrived 35 miles southwest of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The two Union cavalry brigades that had arrived the day earlier began to fight the Confederate forces. For a while, the Confederate forces were winning. Seeking to win the battle before more Union troops arrived, Lee ordered Ewell, the replacement for Stonewall Jackson, who was mortally wounded from the Battle of Chancellorsville, to attack the Union Army from a place called Cemetery Hill. Ewell declined, reasoning that the Union Army was just simply too strong. This was the South's downfall. From this battle, Ulysses S. Grant became more recognized for being a good general. Grant had effectively turned the tides of war. The Union had the upper hand after the bloodiest battle of the Civil War had finished. The Army of Northern Virginia crossed through the country stripped of food and supplies. The Union Army led by Philip Sheridan had outrun Robert E. Lee's forces and blocked their retreat and took in 6,000 of their soldiers as prisoners. Many Southerners deserted the Confederate forces, and by April 8th, the Southern forces were completely surrounded. On April 9th, Lee sent a letter to General Ulysses Grant announcing his willingness to surrender. Lee and Grant met, where Grant decided to pardon all officers and men of the South, where they would be sent home with their private property. Lee's starving soldiers would also receive Union rations. As the band began to play in celebration, Grant told his officers, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." The Civil War had officially ended.